Our topic this evening is the Stoic Jesus. And we're not saying in this that Jesus was a Stoic philosopher, but Stoicism was one of the major and ultimately one of the most popular practical philosophies in the Greco-Roman world of Jesus' contemporaries. And so those ideas were in the mix, and there is some overlap between Stoic ideas and Jesus' teachings. And then also as Christianity grew and developed, Stoicism continued to have some influence, and that continued to be the case after Christianity then in late antiquity became the state religion of the Roman Empire and kind of co-opted some of the Greco-Roman philosophical ideas, including ideas of the Stoics. So that's our topic tonight. The historical Jesus, of course, was operating within the traditions of what we call Second Temple Judaism. And so Judaism emerges in the First Temple period when it's probably at that stage essentially indistinguishable from other Canaanite religions. We have the Moabite stele that is telling us that the Moabites had a relatively similar idea of a monolatrous God, where they are focused not on worshiping the one God of the universe, but rather their God, the God of their people, the God of Moab, or the God of Israel, who they turn to alone, even though they're not making claims that he's the only God. That temple is destroyed by the Babylonians. The elite are taken away into exile in Babylon, and when the Babylonians are overthrown by the Persians and are allowed to return home under Persian rule, they could build the Second Temple. That brings us to the Second Temple period. So the first part of the Second Temple period is under the Persians, but after Alexander the Great overthrows that empire, 3 centuries before the life of Jesus, Greek ideas become the paramount. They're the most popular thing that is going on. They are the kings and the Hellenistic kingdoms are actively promoting Hellenism, and we know from all sorts of sources like Josephus, but also like the various books of the Maccabees, that in Judea itself, in Second Temple Judaism, Hellenistic ideas are something that appeals to a wide percentage of the Judean population. It's sometimes presented as a conflict between Judeans and Greeks. Actually, it's an inter-Jewish conflict or intra-Jewish conflict where many Jewish leaders are very much embracing Hellenistic ideas, which they think are completely compatible with their religion, while others would like to draw the line and exclude some of these ideas and draw a circle around their own traditions. So in other words, these are ideas that have been very much in the mix, and even more so than in Judea, in the northern province of Galilee, which had been part of the original northern kingdom, but now has a mixed population of some people who are Judean, other people who are what we think of as Syro-Phoenicians or Canaanites, some people that we think of as Hellenized, or now Canaanites who have become Greek-speaking or are Greek transplants. There's a very mixed population in the Galilee, and indeed in the little town that Jesus grows up in, that Jesus is from, Nazareth, it is just down the street from this new Greek city of Sepphoris, which is one of the capitals that is being built by Herod the Tetrarch, one of Herod the Great's sons, a client who is ruling over the Galilee on behalf of his Roman overlords. And so, by contrast to a lot of the developmental ideas that people would like to have, so like almost all ancient figures, we know nothing about the youth and childhood of Jesus. It's not surprising. That's almost never do we have more than a couple stories that ancient people might tell of the childhood of even an important historical figure. And so there's these lost years that people would love to fill. So maybe, the thing that people like the most is the idea that Jesus went off to India and learned about Buddhism. And that is a completely false fantasy. When I say that out loud, it's making some people listening to me right now very sad, and they disagree with me. That's simply not how history works. When there is, zero evidence like that of anything in antiquity of a figure doing something like that, we can't make the case that they did that. It has nothing to do with how history works. That's simply a fanciful hypothesis, like the medieval traditions that Jesus came, guess who made these traditions? That the British people made, that Jesus came to Britain or something like that as a child. So the most likely scenario is that Jesus spent his whole childhood in Nazareth and the immediate surrounding areas the way any peasant would. If he had been the guy who went to India and came back, that's what he would be known for, as other ancient people in the Roman world who actually went to India. That was what they became famous for. Nevertheless, as opposed to being directly influenced by Buddhism or by the Celts or somebody, Jesus absolutely could have been exposed to ideas of Hellenism because, again, for 3 centuries, the territory has been Hellenized, and now he's part of a Roman Empire where Greek is the language of administration for the Romans in the eastern half of their empire. The Romans are also very, very taken with Greek ideas, even if they maintain their own feelings of superiority over the Greeks because of what they think of as Roman law, Roman virtue, and Roman military might. So by the Roman period of philosophies, of Greek philosophies, Hellenistic philosophies, Stoicism had really gained ground and had become one of the most popular schools, along with Cynicism, Epicureanism, and Platonism, among others, but especially those maybe big 4. So while Jesus, like I say, was not a Stoic philosopher, we'll see tonight that some of his teachings are pretty compatible with Stoicism. And also, of course, in later centuries, as Christianity evolved, we'll see that it adopted additional ideas from the Stoics. And so that's our scope for tonight's lecture. So I want to back up and just talk about the general background from which Jesus is operating and also from which philosophers are operating. So Jesus as a religious reformer within the Judean, the Israelite tradition, the philosophers as religious reformers within the Greek tradition. So from time immemorial, ancient Mediterranean peoples, the Canaanites, the Israelites, the Egyptians, Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, and so forth, they all engaged in ritual sacrifice in order to do things like maintaining cosmic functions. So you're performing sacrifices in order to make sure the sun rises again the next day, so that the rains will come, so that your crops will grow, so that there's fertility both of the earth and also of the people. And so this is something that had been done, it's something that is prehistoric. In other words, this is inherited from before there's a written tradition. People are already doing all these things. And so it is when civilization happens and when written civilization starts to happen, people are beginning to then question the underpinnings of a tradition that they don't know the origin of, that they only have myths to tell them the origin of. In other words, stories that are created in order to create an origin story. So the practice of sacrifice remained absolutely central to Greek and Roman worship of traditional gods, so what we sometimes call paganism or polytheism. And it's also central in the Second Temple period to the worship of the God of Israel, both at Jerusalem in Judea and in Samaria at the site of the Samaritan temple. So these religions which are monotheist, we now think of monotheist religions, the Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam as not performing sacrifice, because that's where we are today with Rabbinic Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. But Second Temple Judaism's total focus still was on sacrifice and the power of the priestly elite at the Jerusalem temple as the focus of that religion. So for that caste, the priestly caste from which the high priests were traditionally drawn, the Sadducees or Zadokite caste, during the Hasmonean or Maccabee period, it's not actually drawn from that bloodline. It's the non-Davidic, non-Zadokite royal family of the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans, that provide the high priests or who act as high priests, but it returns to the Sadducee class. In any event, it's a priestly caste that controls the religion then, because all worship has to be done at the Jerusalem temple, and they control the sacrifice that happens there. And so other voices, even though for them, obviously, that's the most important thing, and really everybody in the religion is mostly looking to them and to that function, there nevertheless were voices within the Judean tradition that were very much skeptical of the value of ritual sacrifice. So for example, if we go all the way back to the 8th century before the Common Era in the First Temple period, the original prophet Isaiah channeled the voice of the Lord at the beginning of the book of Isaiah as we have it today, and said, "What to me is the multitude of your sacrifices, says the Lord. I have had enough of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fed beasts. I do not delight in the blood of bulls or of lambs or of goats. Bringing offerings is futile. Incense is an abomination to me. New moon and Sabbath and the calling of convocation, I cannot endure solemn assemblies with iniquity." I don't want you sacrificing. These are they're not helping anything. It's all futile. I don't like your festivals, your new moons, your appointed festivals. My soul hates, says the Lord. They have become a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them. When you stretch out your hands, I will hide my eyes from you. Even though you make many prayers, I will not listen. Your hands are full of blood. So this is a full-throated attack on the religion's central practices as conducted by the high priests and all his priestly attendants, the whole caste, whose monopoly over them was key to their power. So, if you think about it, if God is rejecting sacrifice, if it has no purpose, all of this activity is worse than useless, as is what the prophet is saying here, the prophet Isaiah. So rather than conducting these cosmic maintenance rituals, Isaiah and other prophetic critics, which is to say here are religious reformers, people who are challenging what the priestly elite considers to be the most important thing. So these prophetic critics in the Judean tradition are calling instead for a focus on things like ethics and charity, not cosmic maintenance rituals. So Isaiah, channeling the Lord, continues, "Wash yourselves, make yourselves clean, remove your evil deeds from my eyes, cease to do evil, says the Lord, learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow." So help those who are in need, do charity, do ethical things, behave not evilly but in good, this sort of thing. That's what's important instead of cosmic maintenance ritual. So in addition to critiques from the prophetic tradition, the value of ritual sacrifice at the Jerusalem temple, and also therefore the monopoly that the priests have on the religion, was discounted by voices in the Hebrew wisdom tradition, including Ecclesiastes. So we read in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, guard your steps when you go to the house of the Lord, when you go to the temple. To draw near to listen is better than sacrifice offered by fools, for they do not know how to keep from doing evil. So these priests who were offering sacrifices, they do evil all the time. They're fools. It's better for you to listen to the teacher, to listen to the sage who is going to offer you wisdom, the actual truth, how to be good. So here too, the author of Ecclesiastes contrasts the focus on ritual sacrifice with the, quote, the oppression of the poor and the violation of justice and right, as he mentions a few verses later. So we've looked at before how there are these independent traditions in the Bible, a whole long wisdom tradition, the whole long prophetic tradition that diverge and are different from the voices that are writing things like the Deuteronomic history tradition and also especially the priestly code and law tradition. So the priests also get to express their perspective in biblical books, especially in books like the Pentateuch, the Torah, so Genesis, Exodus, especially Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, which are all about, all of these kind of boring priestly rules and rituals and things like that discourage people from getting all the way through the Bible, because you go through some very captivating, interesting stories in Genesis and Exodus, and suddenly you get to the priestly author who I find to be just intolerably boring. So they nevertheless, though, are very important. They are bringing they're bringing those books and trying to make those be the most important books. And although ultimately, as they are gathered together in the Hebrew Bible, and especially side by side in the Old Testament of Christianity's Bible, these authors who have very much strong disagreement, who actually don't like each other and who are calling what each other thinks, they're saying it's pointless, it's worthless, it's that you're fools, if you follow the priests and so forth. Those exist side by side in the Bible. And so it's very wrong when modern Christians read the text and think it's all just speaking with one voice and you can just pull out some verse from any part of it and imagine that is a rule that you can take and live by now, because in fact it's actually contradictory to plenty of other voices in the Bible. So essentially there are a priestly caste who are in charge of inherited practices, and they're also reformers already as the context in the Second Temple Jewish tradition. And that's the context that Jesus emerges in. So the debate there is something that Jesus will have grown up with. And in the Gospels, anyway, Jesus is portrayed as critiquing priestly law. So he'll quote a part of Leviticus. He'll say, "You've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, in other words, that's what is written in the law, but that's not how you should live." And so he's critiquing priestly law. And he's also drawing upon both the prophetic and wisdom traditions as portrayed again in the Gospels. So in this particular medieval image, icon of Jesus, he's opened a codex actually, but he's opened the Torah scroll, let's say, or it's not the Torah scroll, the prophet scroll to Isaiah, and he does this in the Gospel of Luke, and he reads from it in the synagogue, and he says, I've come to set the captives free, to declare of the year of the Lord's favor, and so forth. In other words, he's going to do these things that Isaiah is interested in, helping the widow, freeing the captive, helping the oppressed, and so forth, visiting the prisoner. So he's drawing on the prophetic tradition there, and he also draws on the wisdom traditions, as his teachings are often not couched in a "thus saith the Lord" style of prophetic utterance, but instead are seeking to persuade. When he asks you to consider the lilies and so forth, that's not a "thus saith the Lord," it is a wisdom tradition inheritance. So while all of that is going on in Judea and Galilee and so forth in the Israelite tradition, meanwhile, at the same time or in the same hundreds of years, in the Greek-speaking world, thinkers have also been voicing a similar dissatisfaction with the perceived hollowness of these inherited rituals whose focus is on cosmic maintenance rather than things like ethics or charity, being good, doing good. So Socrates, active in the 5th century, generally considered or called the founder of Western philosophy, where all of the thinkers before him in the Greek tradition are called pre-Socratic because he's the thinker beyond which that is the prism and everything changes. So Socrates really famously questions all of the preconceptions of his contemporaries regarding everything. They think that they know why, what the gods want. They think they know what piety is. They think they know what it is to live a good life. Socrates kind of questions them. He asks where they get this idea. He trips them up and he finds out that they believe things that are logically inconsistent and leaves them scratching their heads, usually wondering, well, what to make of it. Socrates himself left no writings. He doesn't believe in that. He believes in having active dialogue with his immediate contemporaries. But fortunately for us, his influential student, Plato, had other ideas and believed that you could write dialogues down that would continue to invite people into the dialogue yourself. And that has been effective since people have engaged Plato for 2.5 millennia since then, or not quite. And so Plato wrote a number of dialogues in which Socrates appears as a character, and some of these cases he may or may not be presenting what the philosopher Socrates would have actually argued, certainly kind of things that he would have been talking about, although over time they more and more represent Plato's thinking, we believe. So in one of these dialogues, the Euthyphro, Plato considers the questions that are the underpinnings of the contemporary inherited religion, that paganism, polytheism, the worship of the old gods. So at one point in this dialogue, Socrates, who's having a conversation with Euthyphro, asks, is the pious, is that which is pious? So as we try to think of what is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious? Or is it pious because it is loved by the gods? So in other words, is there something that is eternally worthy of that which is pious or piety, and that's why the gods like it? Or are the gods the active agents here? Are they picking something, and because they love it, that is why we think of it as pious? And so that dilemma, which ends up being an active theological, philosophical, but especially theological question, really down to the present, leads in the dialogue to, open questioning for the purpose and value of contemporary religious practices like animal sacrifice. So if you were going to offer this great sacrifice at the Temple of Athena, are you just making a transactional exchange with Athena in order to curry her favor? So you've sacrificed this lamb or something like that in order to make sure that this upcoming voyage you make will be safe, and you'll return home, and you'll have been able to accomplish all the trading or whatever you wanted to do. Does that sacrifice, is it just a transaction? You gave that sacrifice to Athena and then she is going to look over you? And one of the things that Socrates want to ask, okay, well, if the gods themselves are actually good, rather than just getting, like an animal and being able to smell the the scent or eat the fat or whatever is happening that the gods are getting out of the sacrifice, wouldn't you actually get more favor from the gods when you yourself are being good? And so that's a question about, why are we really doing all these things? Are these things good to do, or isn't it maybe better to be good? And Socrates also asks, well, in the case of paganism and polytheism, there's all these different gods, and maybe they all disagree about things. And so how do you know which one? If you're doing something, one thing, and maybe maybe Poseidon doesn't like that, and Athena does. How do you know what to do? Then it's beyond your pay grade, essentially. Euthyphro in that case says, well, what we can say at least is that piety is what all the gods agree on as being good. So that's essentially the same thing, though. What I'm trying to say is, in the same way that Isaiah from the prophetic tradition, or the author of Ecclesiastes from the Hebrew wisdom tradition is questioning or even totally discounting the value of animal sacrifice, traditional rituals, and things like that of the priests, Socrates and Plato here are doing the very same thing in the Greek context. So we talked about Socrates as the father or the founder of the Western philosophical tradition. And so I've got another chart that has all the pre-Socratic philosophers that come before this. One of those pre-Socratic philosophers is Pythagoras, and I've just mentioned him here because he has a knock-on effect. But essentially, from Socrates and his students emerge all of the major schools of the Greco-Roman Hellenistic philosophical thought. And so we have on the main line here, Socrates' number one student, Plato, who founds the Academy. The Academy itself ultimately becomes kind of a bastion of skepticism, but Plato inspires a school, the Platonists, later Middle Platonists, finally Neoplatonists, so a very active tradition that is one of the most popular traditions at the middle of the Roman Empire. Plato's number one student, Aristotle, disagreed with him on a number of things. So Plato is especially interested in the immaterial world, which he sees as eternal and unchanging and therefore more real and more important, whereas Aristotle is much more focused on what we can learn from the material world, from the natural world. And so the Aristotelians also have a school that continues. But Socrates has more students than this. One of his students here, Aristippus of Cyrene, in answering the question Socrates poses, how does one live a good life? Aristippus is one of many people who say, well, pain and lack of pleasure, all those kind of things that are causing you discomfort, that's bad, and so you want to minimize that in life, and what you want to maximize is having satisfactory outcomes where you are feeling pleasure, where you're feeling good about things. And so that kind of philosophy is termed as hedonism, and sometimes we think of hedonism as being, let's say, giving into the basest kinds of pleasures that you might have. So we think of hedonists really as sex addicts and things like that. But usually philosophical hedonists actually are talking about, they're not talking about like these strong pleasures or whatever but fleeting pleasure that you get from like becoming a heroin addict or something like that, because that also comes with all kinds of discomfort. So instead they usually have a bunch of rules about how do you moderate and things so that you can always have a kind of a constant good of pleasure. So that school is followed then by Aristippus of Cyrene and the Cyrenaic school, and that ultimately also influences the major school after Epicurus, and the Epicureans kind of get going. And Epicurus I just have on here is also being influenced by Democritus, because he is the father of atomism. So the atomists and Epicureans also get into this position where things like the gods don't matter because what's actually happening here in the material world is all these little atoms that are going around, and it's almost random what is all happening, as opposed to any kind of purpose or plan. And so you should eat, drink, and be merry under those circumstances. So if we go the other way, one of Socrates' other students, Antisthenes, is a proto-cynic, maybe. So he is a person who answers that the good life or the pure life is led through a kind of asceticism where you are not giving into any kind of excesses. And Antisthenes' school leads to Diogenes, who is the kind of precursor, or the main poster person for the Cynic school. And so Diogenes wants to live entirely in harmony with nature. He wants to get rid of all excesses, any kind of customs that are meaningless, personal property even. He is famous for, more or less living in a jar and having just the minimum begging for the little minimum amount of food he needs to drink or to eat. And when he sees, for example, a boy who has been able to drink water out of his hands, he realizes the fact that he's been having a cup all this time is a waste, and so he gets rid of that kind of thing. So that creates the Cynic school, and from the Cynic school emerges finally a guy named Zeno of Citium, who is the originator of the Stoics. And so that's going to get us then to all of our major schools anyway of popular Greco-Roman philosophy. So like I said, Plato was the most famous disciple of Socrates, as well as the teacher of Aristotle. He founds the academy. That's where we get the word academy. And of course, he's the inspiration for Platonism. And if we just take a thumbnail, so his answer for living the good life, he kind of devalues the material world. This is not important. It's anything that you can sense is impermanent. It's not going to last. And so instead, he wants to seek after eternal ideals, those things that are perfect, they're immaterial, they're the spiritual forms or ideas, of which the idea of the good for Plato is the first and foremost. Antisthenes, we mentioned, is a different disciple of Socrates. This is the one that's going to lead to that, to the development of Cynicism and also Stoicism. Unfortunately, we don't have very much of his voluminous writings, but he taught that virtue, as opposed to pleasure, is the purpose and meaning of life. And so therefore he's opposed to the hedonists and ultimately the Epicureans. And so he says that everything that the wise person does conforms to perfect virtue. And so he practiced a kind of asceticism. So he abstains from worldly pleasures in order to live the good life. So you can see that's like exact opposite philosophical answer that one of Socrates' other students has. Diogenes, who is a follower of Antisthenes, this is the quintessential Cynic, as we said. So for him, traditions, social and cultural norms are meaningless. Virtue is best demonstrated in actions rather than words, and so he lived a radical ascetic life. Like I said, he begged for living, he slept in a jar in the marketplace. He considered voluntary poverty and being a mendicant to be virtuous, and he also tried to jar his fellow citizens out of their complacency. So Socrates had made himself a nuisance by going around and asking everybody questions. Diogenes does even more than that by doing lots of theatrical stuff in the middle of the square. And we have, in other, when we've talked about the historical Jesus and some of the academic takes that modern day 21st century scholars of the historical Jesus have, one of those is the idea that as a person who is leading a mendicant movement, that is, people who have given up property in order to concentrate on spiritual matters, who are begging each day for their daily bread, that Jesus and his disciples in some ways are doing things similar to what the popular Cynic philosopher in the nearby Hellenistic city might have been doing, but they're doing it now in a a Judean context as opposed to in a Greek context. And so that is one possibility, and we need to actually have a whole lecture on the Cynic Jesus, so that'll be a future one. But even doing things like like a public demonstration, going into the temple marketplace and turning over tables because you're saying money has no place in the house of God, which is supposed to be a spiritual thing, that's very much in keeping with what a Diogenes would do. In other words, getting into people's face and having some kind of a very public demonstration to challenge their inherited social cultural norms. So that just brings us back. I just want to look at the chart one more time so you can see the direction as we've spelled it out a little bit more. So that brings us, I'm following the chart, Socrates on to the right of the chart here, Antisthenes, Diogenes, and then we'll get here to Zeno. So Zeno was a rich Greco-Phoenician merchant. He's born in Cyprus, the town of Kidium. So he studied under the Cynic Socrates, but then derived his own system of ethics out of what the Cynics are doing. He also studied Platonism and other philosophies, and so he founds a new kind of synthesis that becomes the last of these, but really important schools of Hellenistic philosophy. So he taught in the agora, which is essentially the Greek word for forum, the public market, at Athens, at a place called the Painted Porch, and the Greek word for porch is stoa, and so because him and all his students are hanging out in the stoa, they're called Stoics. And so he's the founder of the Stoic school. He wrote a lost treatise called The Republic, but it very much disagrees with Plato's dialogue of the same name. And so in Plato's Republic, Plato sort of self-servingly concludes that the people who should really rule society are philosophers. So he envisions in the ultimate utopian society a kind of a dictatorship of philosopher kings. Zeno, by contrast, envisions a perfectly egalitarian society. So Stoicism cuts across social station. It becomes a very popular philosophy, and it endures for some 6 centuries. And people, everybody from slaves and to emperors, could consider themselves Stoics. And so, indeed, when we're getting to this period of time prior to the real rise of Christianity or the takeover of Christianity in the 4th century, in the 2nd and especially 3rd century, there's a spiritual crisis in the Roman Empire, and more people are turning to ethical philosophies, and especially things like Stoicism, because they are more meaningful to them than, again, these just increasingly hollow-seeming rituals of cosmic maintenance, essentially just doing, ritually what the priests are doing or following the priests. And so Stoicism ends up being very much a living tradition, and there's all kinds of continuity of philosophers within the tradition. We have Zeno here, Chrysippus. One of the famous ones in the late Stoa period, in the Roman period, is Seneca, and then Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius, people are very aware of. He actually is finally the emergence of the true philosopher king, kind of the height of this popular moment of, when, like I say, these Greco-Roman or Hellenistic popular or practical philosophies become, relatively widespread. Right now, if you think of philosophy, this is something that a very small percentage of the population is really engaged in and really thinking seriously, or where they're calling themselves, some kind of a philosopher. It was much more widespread at this period in the Roman Empire, especially considering so much smaller educated class and so much less literacy. So Stoicism was a very cosmopolitan philosophy. The Stoic philosopher Seneca said, "Remember that he whom you call your slave sprang from the same stock, is smiled upon by the same skies and is on equal terms with yourself. And on equal terms with yourself breathes, lives, and dies. So this is pretty, let's say, radical compared to what's going on in the common reality of the lived reality, where slaves are enslaved people are a very different category of being for most people in a world that is built on the institution of enslaving people. A lot of other philosophical traditions, Aristotle justifies all sorts of things in terms of their being and natural hierarchy and so forth. The Stoics are like, no, what's true here is that we're all humans, and even if some people are enslaved, they have the same basic humanity that the emperor does. And Epictetus, who is one of these famous Stoic philosophers, had been a slave. He was later a free man. And another one of these, like I say, Stoic philosophers is actually the Roman emperor, Marcus Aurelius. One thing about the Stoic system, perhaps more than any other of the systems, I guess later Neoplatonism gets pretty complete as well. Certainly Aristotle tried to make a complete system of everything, absolutely. So with those in all those kind of cases, there is a total system, but Stoicism especially has a fully complete interlocking system. And it is based on a Stoic triad, which the Stoics called ethics, logic, and physics. But in each case, this is Stoic ethics, Stoic logic, Stoic physics. So for Stoics, their ethical goal is to live life in accordance with nature. And you can see that that's sort of an inheritance from what Diogenes and the Cynics are trying to do. They're trying to live a very simple, unencumbered life that's in accordance with nature. And that continues to inform the Stoic ethical system. To achieve this goal, though, they want to behave in a very consistent, logical way. So take actions that are very consistent and logical. And the Stoics envision a hypothetical, ideal sage who is always acting by doing, what is the best thing to do under every circumstance. And a lot of cases, because there isn't any one best thing to do, it's better to just not do anything, and that's part of their system. And then finally, the Stoic physics is a understanding of the universe itself as nature. So the universe is, by being infused with a divine thinking essence, the universe itself becomes nature with a capital N and is also God. And so therefore, the Stoic system has been described as pantheism, that is, the universe, everything in the material universe is, in fact, divine, is God, all taken together. And so the Stoics understood their system as an organic unity. You have to have the ethics as your goal. You have to have the logical and consistent way of achieving the goal. Those are all based on the reality of how the universe actually is. And so, in other words, living in harmony with nature relies on this knowledge, the Stoic knowledge of what nature actually is. So they're living life in harmony with God, understanding that God is nature in the Stoic system. So Zeno, this founder of Stoicism, has this to say in describing Stoic physics. He says the end, or rather the purpose, may be defined, one's purpose may be defined as life in accordance with nature, or, in other words, in accordance with our own human nature, as well as that nature of the universe. He says also, a bad feeling is a commotion of the mind. It's repugnant to reason and is therefore against nature. And he says also that which exercises reason is more excellent, than that which does not exercise reason. There is nothing more excellent than the universe. Therefore, the universe exercises reason. So you can see how Stoic logic here, pulls all of these things together: the physics, the ethics, and the logic. We look at Stoic physics then. It is very much opposed to Platonic idealism. So the Stoics are very much about the material world. Plato says that this pulpit here is only a shallow shadow physical form of what the ideal of an eternal pulpit is, and that eternal pulpit that is perfect and will never change and never be destroyed. That's what's really real, and this is just a fragment of that. And the Stoics are like, no, the material, there's no forms. The material pulpit is the pulpit. They're also opposed to the other materialists, the Epicureans, who I say believe everything is composed at some level at atoms, which what that means is not what we now think of as atoms, but rather some tiny, invisible, essentially microscopic form beyond which matter can't be divided anymore. And since all of those have been set in motion and they're all continuing in motion, the implication is that you can't tell what's going to happen, or anything is going to happen. Stoics are very much opposed to that. They don't believe in atomism, and they do believe that the universe, which is God and which is nature, is acting very purposefully and providentially according to the universe's plan. Everything for the Stoics is interconnected. Everything does move by cause and effect, and that is all can be traced back, though, not to random motion of atoms, but to a first cause that is God. So God, which infuses the universe. Nature is then a rational world soul, which is immanent in everything. So the divine is infusing the whole of the material cosmos, and it's also infusing the cosmos with purpose, according to the Stoics. They all call nature reason, that is to say, the logos. And maybe our ears are going to start picking up at using this word logos to describe the divine. And divine nature is in everything, both animate and inanimate. But humans have a special divine quality of rationality, of logos. So there's also logos in humans. Humans are participating in that. Humans achieve happiness for the Stoics when they use rationality to study and understand nature, and then to live in accordance with nature's reason. So live according to the logos, attune your logos to the fully divine logos of God, of nature. So if providence, if nature has given us cold weather by fate and destiny, like here in Toronto, it sometimes happens. We had a pretty cold winter once again last year. The answer is, for the Stoic, well, you can't control that snow and cold. You can either hate it, and we can spend all our day complaining about the weather, and we can be miserable that it's cold and awful when it is here. Or we can, like the ideal Stoic sage, we would be totally unaffected by what is outside of our control, and we would adapt ourselves in accord with nature and be happy. So our own logos, our own reason is then brought into harmony with the divine logos, with the divine nature. So this brings us to ancient Stoic ideas of logic. So pain and misfortune, like pleasure, they're not entirely within one's control. And therefore, they fall within a category that the Stoics call the indifferents. These are things that you just have to be indifferent to. The sage has to be indifferent to because you can't control them. The sage there makes sure that they are unaffected by all indifference, everything that is an external circumstance that you can't control that is actually happening by fate. So you can't control any of that. Instead, though, the sage has the power to determine his or her own attitude towards those outside events. And so, as Epictetus says, some things are in our control and others are not. Things in our control are things like opinion, pursuit, desire, aversion, and in a word, whatever are our own actions. Things not in control are our body, property, our reputation, command, and in a word, whatever are not our own actions. So we worry about those things that we're in control of, and we have to be indifferent to the things that we can't control. The only good, as far as Stoics are concerned, is virtue. And virtue is informed by our rational disposition. And the opposite is also true. The only evil is vice, and that is defined as irrational action. So, as we saw, in those two branches off of Socrates, in terms of the Cynic branch that ultimately leads to the Stoics, and on the other side, the hedonist branch that leads to the Epicureans, hedonists think if it feels right, if it's pleasure, that is actually good. But that's inimical to Stoicism. It feels so right, it can't be wrong. That's not Stoicism. So true happiness is goodness. It's an internal disposition of the logos, of our rational mind, and it's achieved when we have actions that are consistently determined by reasoning, when we reason and do things that is in accord with the divine logos, which is nature. Okay, so what if you get sick? I mean, isn't being healthy good? Isn't sickness bad? What do you think? No, health is not good. Sickness is not bad. Health is simply a natural advantage. It's not something you can control. Something that it's a more positive indifferent. In other words, it's a better indifferent, but it's something that you still can't be. Still have to be indifferent to, like you have to do sickness. And so even torture, falls into the category of things about which the sage is indifferent. It's not something to complain about. You can't stop the people from torturing you. If you have the right attitude, you can be happy even when you're on the rack for a perfect Stoic sage. So as Seneca the Younger says, if you apply reason to difficulties, harsh circumstances can be softened, narrow limits can be widened, and burdensome things can be made to press less severely on those who can bear them cleverly. Men do not care how nobly they live, but only how long. And this is really ironic because it's within the reach of every man to live nobly. In other words, that's something we can control, but it's within no man's power to live long. That's an external thing. You could, have a car accident tomorrow and be gone. So people are unhappy because they're always worrying about something that they can't control, just wishing for eternal, immortality or living a long, long life. But actually, what you really should be seeking after, the Stoics say, is to live a noble and virtuous life, which you can do based on your own actions that are in your control. So it's not a man who has too little, but it's a man who craves more that is poor. So Elon Musk is the richest man in the world, but if he also, isn't satisfied because he wants to be able to have an actual, robotaxi company that actually works, or to make robots or something, or get to the moon by last year, and he wasn't able to do any of those things, he's the person who's poor despite all the money he has, because he's craving all these things that he wants and can't have and won't ever have. So true happiness for the Stoics results from virtue, and they have 4 pillars of virtue that they define as essentially wisdom, what we might call practical wisdom. justice, self-control, and courage. And just as with the triad, where each one of these is necessary for the other, this is also true for the virtues. You all need these in order, you have to behave with all four of these if you were to pursue a rational disposition. If your own portion of the logos is being lived rationally in harmony with the divine logos, with nature, then you are going to be seeking after what's wise to do in a practical sense. You're seeking justice, you're exercising all this self-control, and you're acting with a lot of courage. So can you have courage and not any of those other things? No. None of these can exist for the Stoic without all of them existing together. It's all or nothing for the Stoics. So if we look in practice then at ancient Stoic ethics, the Stoics don't claim to have achieved this condition, even though they want it all to exist all at once in order for it to actually be there. Rather, they are continually working towards this goal. And they do this through spiritual practices like meditation. And so the Emperor Marcus Aurelius's work famously is called the Meditations. These are things that he meditated on daily in order to continue to be in the right mindset, in order to be able to try to live out these ideals. And so both Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius are constantly urging themselves to maintain indifference to circumstances and to only value moral choice. So from those meditations of the emperor, we can read, for example, he says, "You have power over your mind, not over outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." So if you're constantly worrying about what's happening in terms of the politics of the country, all of the things that are falling apart, this and that, you don't really have control over all of that. You have power, though, over your mind, not over those outside events. If you keep that in mind, that's going to give you strength, according to Marcus Aurelius. And here's a guy who actually was the emperor. So here's a rule to remember in the future, he says, when anything tempts you to feel bitter. So he says, don't think of it as this is misfortune, but rather to bear this worthily is good fortune. So some terrible thing has happened, and if you are able to, you lose your job or something like that, if you sit around and wallow in your misfortune and saying, oh, woe is me, this is the worst thing that ever happened to me. If you have that in mind, that is going to be, you'll be existing in misfortune. But if you do what Marcus Aurelius says, if you think, okay, if I bear what's happened to me in a worthy way, then that's good fortune. I will have emerged out of this circumstances and a better person, an improved person. So Marcus Aurelius also says, begin each day by telling yourself, today I shall be meeting with interference, with ingratitude, with insolence, with disloyalty, with ill will and selfishness. All of them due to the offender's ignorance of what is good or evil. So when you think of all of the rotten things that people do when they encounter you, if you think of them because the person is acting out of ignorance, as opposed to like that they're out to get you, or they're doing something that is where you're thinking of your own personal misfortune, you will be in a better mental health condition. You will be less angry. You will be less feel less put upon, and so forth. So that's an overview of Greco-Roman Stoicism. So how compatible is all of that philosophically with Jesus? So some components of Stoicism, so for example, identifying God as the first cause, all this talk we've just had of a divine logos, this idea that many things occur according to a kind of divine providence, this focus on goodness and virtue, all that might have sounded similar to all of you in this lead up to getting to thinking about Christianity and compare and contrast. And I also think some of Jesus' teachings feel like they could serve as meditations similar to the ones that the Emperor Marcus Aurelius rehearsed daily. And so, like the Stoics, Jesus taught his disciples to focus on what is in their control, their own selves, rather than what is outside of their control, what is in the control of others. So, for example, in the Sermon on the Mount, in the 5th chapter of Matthew, 5th through 7th chapters of Matthew, one of the things that we read is Jesus saying, "Do not judge, so that you may not be judged. For the judgment you give will be the judgment you get, and the measure you give will be the measure you get." So as you are going out and affecting others in a negative way, that affects you negatively. And that is one of the things that then later on we get to the formulation of the golden rule that exists in the Sermon on the Mount. In everything, do to others as you would have them do to you. There's other sayings from within the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus says, "I say to you, if you're angry with a brother or sister, you'll be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother and sister, you will be liable to the council. Do not resist an evildoer. If anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, give your coat as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you." So in all of these teachings, Jesus counsels his disciples to act virtuously themselves. They have the power to do that. So don't judge others. Do unto others. Don't be angry with others, and so forth. And just as importantly, when others are behaving badly towards you in the opposite way, don't answer them in kind. Don't return an eye for an eye or tooth for tooth, but instead turn the other cheek, give your coat as well, go the extra mile, pray for those who persecute you. Jesus also counsels his disciples not to worry about temporal things in a way that seems compatible with the Stoic attitude against worrying. So Jesus says, "Do not worry about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, or about your body or what you'll wear. Is not life more than food and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they? And which of you, by worrying, can add a single hour to your lifespan?" It sounded like we just heard the Cynic philosopher who's talking about how people are always worried about wanting to live forever and wanting to live a long, long time, and there's nothing that they can do about it. That's not in their control. "Why do you worry about clothing? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin, yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not clothed like one of these. If God so clothes the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith? Therefore, do not worry, saying, what will we eat, or what will we drink, or what will we wear?" So singling out in this teaching, food and drink and clothing, that actually may be even more compatible with the ancient Cynics, of which the Stoics, emerged off of. So the Cynics, as we remember, rejected property and were really all about living simply and naturally as mendicants, often begging for food and drink and so forth, with living with little clothes and so on. Nevertheless, I think the emphasis here on not worrying about such things is also very Stoic. It's an attitude thing about what you can control. As we saw, a significant amount of Stoic thought involved considering how a hypothetical ideal sage would act in any given situation. And that was presented as an ideal to which all Stoics can aspire. And so I think although the gospel portraits diverge from how the historical Jesus actually would have lived, they do paint a picture of a kind of divine man who reacts to his surroundings in some cases like perhaps the ideal Stoic sage might. In other words, with that kind of indifference to the things that he can't control. And so in the same way that Stoics hypothesize an ideal sage that they are sort of emulating, the idea of having a portrait of an ideal Jesus that is a model for Christian behavior, is a little bit similar too. And so, for example, in an incident like when Jesus got into the boat on the Sea of Galilee, his disciples followed him. A windstorm suddenly arose on the sea, so great that the boat was being swamped by the waves, but Jesus was asleep. And the disciples went and they woke him up, saying, "Lord, save us, we are perishing." And Jesus said to them, "Why are you afraid, you of little faith?" And then he got up and rebuked the winds and the sea. So again, although this is the story of a divine man, in some ways the ideal Stoic sage is also a divine man. But anyway, this is a divine man who has power over nature. Jesus' words to his disciples telling them, don't fear a windstorm. That is to say, don't worry about this thing you have no control over. That can be read with Stoic resonance. Jesus' own acceptance of his future crucifixion as he prays in the Garden of Gethsemane also aligns with the Stoic response to a fated providence. So in Matthew 26, we read, going a little further, Jesus threw himself on the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet, not what I want, but what you want." So, in other words, this is something that he is willing to accept, even though it's going to be, this horrific suffering and death. Jesus also then follows his own counsel to pray for those who persecute them when he says on the cross in the Gospel of Luke, "Father, forgive them, they do not know what they're doing," to all of the people who are killing him. And so, again, this is reminiscent of the Stoic attitude towards forgiving others, not harming others, only being worried about what you yourself are controlling, the virtuous actions that you can do, and being indifferent to even torture when it's being happened to you and you have no control over it. So these principles, things like do not answer evil with evil, are found in other New Testament writings and so reflect Christian thought in the first century. So for example, the first epistle of Peter, we read, "Do not repay evil for evil or abuse for abuse, but on the contrary, repay with a blessing." So even when you are receiving terrible actions from others, you should be behaving in a way that is virtuous and right and returning that. You're modeling what is good. This is the same kind of thing that Marcus Aurelius is saying as he is receiving all of this indifference and pettiness and everything else, that he nevertheless needs to behave in a way that is virtuous. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, chapter 12, echoes that same sentiment. He says, "Bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be arrogant, but associate with the lowly. Do not claim to be wiser than you are. Do not repay anyone evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all." I mean, that seems like a very Stoic sentiment. We're always you're supposed to take charge of what you're able to handle and live nobly, and don't simply do evil things just because that's happening to you. If it's possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. So far as it depends on you, it's your own, that's you're in your capacity. Obviously, you can't live peacefully with everybody if you're on the if you're being attacked, that you can't control what other people are doing, but as it depends on you, you can. Beloved, he says, never avenge yourselves, but leave room for the wrath of God, for it's written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Instead, if your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they are thirsty, give them something to drink. For by doing this, you will heap burning coals on their heads. So don't be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Oh, overcome evil with good. So, I guess I'm missing one slide there. So in other words, there's a beginning of this too. There's one more sentiment from Paul. This is in, I think, his letter to the Galatians. He says, he has learned to be content, Paul has learned to be content with whatever he has. So he can't worry about all the things he doesn't have, just like Stoics. I know what it is to have little, and I know what it is to have plenty. In any and all circumstances, I have learned the secret of being well-fed and of going hungry, of having plenty and of being in need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. In any case, it was kind of you to share my distress. So the Galatians have said, we're sorry to hear you've been in this terrible way. But he's saying, don't worry about me, because I know the secret of this whole thing, just like the Stoic who is in prison and understands himself to be free in his heart, he's free, as opposed to an emperor who is captive to his job because he hates it so much, or something like that. His attitude is what it makes him miserable. And so Paul, like that, has also learned to be content regardless of whatever the material concerns and situation are. So this general compatibility between some of the values expressed by Stoics and some of the values expressed by Christians explains, I think, why Christians ended up co-opting many Stoic teachings. And when the Roman Empire made Christianity a state religion, this allowed Stoicism to have ongoing influence. So, for example, if we look back at the Stoic philosopher like Seneca, Christians continued to have within their education curriculum, they would read things that pagan philosophers and pagan orators and even the mythology as part of learning rhetoric and as their education system, grammar, and so forth. And when they look back at philosophers, Stoic philosophers like Seneca, many Christians regarded them as being almost like a proto-Christian, that they had the inspiration of the Holy Spirit or something like that, that allowed them to preach what Christians sort of even heard as almost gospel principles before being Christian. And there was even a whole set of Christian kind of forgeries where they write like letters that happened between Paul and Seneca with the idea that maybe Seneca actually was kind of learning to become a Christian or converts or something like that. These are fantasy letters, but it shows Christian attitudes towards Stoic philosophers like Seneca, who continued to be very influential through the Middle Ages. So nevertheless, we saw, though, that Stoicism was a complete interlocking system. And even though Christians were interested in some of it, they weren't interested in all of the pieces, which means the system as a whole was not actually preserved. So some of Stoicism was incompatible with Christian theology especially. So we saw that the Stoics used the word logos to describe the rational component of God that infuses and animates the physical universe. And we saw that for the Stoics, humans too possess a portion of the divine logos, our own reason, that connects us to that universal logos. Get some more water here. However, because the Stoics are materialists, so we talked about how Plato was more interested in the eternal, immaterial world, but the Stoics believed that everything is material. The logos, too, is seen as a material substance. So unlike the Platonists who view God and all of the divine, everything eternal, as entirely immaterial and spiritual, the Stoics are like, no, no, no. The only thing that exists is the material universe. And so God and even the logos that is connecting everything in the universe is also material. And so a lot of people complained, well, how can God be infusing us when we all have physical substance? You're saying that two physical things are in the same place at once, which is not possible. And so the Stoics would reply to that, well, it's like, like mixing a gin and tonic. The two come together. There's two physical substances, but they make a perfect mix, or something like that. So for Christians, though, the logos is like how the Stoics saw it. It's understood to be the source of being for all creation, including humans. And humans are participating in the logos, but God is understood to be transcendent and immaterial rather than physical. And so for this reason, Christian theology was much more compatible with Neoplatonism. So Plato's idea of what God is and the forms and everything like that ended up being completely much more in keeping and in harmony with Christian theology. And so even though, the great final Neoplatonic philosopher Plotinus, operating in the 3rd century in Rome, even though he is quite anti-Christian, doesn't like Christianity, nevertheless, a lot of his ideas end up getting borrowed and co-opted and brought into Christianity, slightly reworked by Augustine and his successors in order to create Christian theology. Likewise, in addition to Stoic physics being rejected, physics and metaphysics, we say physics because they think everything's material, whereas Christians would call it metaphysics because it's the things that are beyond physics. Likewise, Christian thinkers preferred Aristotle's system of logic to the Stoic system of logic. And Aristotle's system so displaced all of the other systems, including the Stoic system, that when we talk about logic, we really pretty much we mean Aristotle's logic. But there was a very different theory and understanding of logic that was part of that whole Stoic system, which ended up, because it wasn't adopted by the Christians, it ended up getting lost and actually forgotten, and is only really recovered in the early modern period where it could be studied again. So instead, like I say, Aristotle, who otherwise his works were mostly lost in the Latin West and Christendom because it's remained in Greek, one of the few surviving components of Aristotle's thought that did make it and continued to inform the Latin West was his works of logic, which Boethius translated. So Boethius is that great late antique Christian philosopher who had been the prime minister to Theodoric in the Ostrogothic kingdom that replaced the West Roman Empire. So Boethius had been planning to translate all of Aristotle into Latin, and that would have changed the entire course of history because Aristotle would have been well known. Instead, he ended up being executed by the king as a traitor, and before that he wrote his own book, The Consolation of Philosophy, one of the great works of all literature, all philosophy. And so Boethius translated that logical section, and so Aristotle's logic is what became the Christian inheritance as opposed to Stoic logic. Another thing that sort of gets rejected by Christians, but not entirely, is the inherent fatalism of Stoics. So Stoics are determinists. That means that they believe that everything is happening according to a purpose, that the universe, that providence is pushing everything forward. Everything that happened in the past was necessary to happen, and it's causing everything to happen very necessarily. And so it's mostly up to us whether we have a positive or negative attitude about what's happening. So we don't control the snow, we control what we feel about the snow. In this case, now that it's summer, that we don't control the heat wave. We can control whether we take it as an occasion to go to the beach, or whether we're walking around and being very miserable and complaining. So even though the Stoics are determinists, they are also what we call compatibilists. So we had a whole lecture on the history of free will and determinism. And so one of the ways that determinists think that that just because everything is determined, it's not necessarily incompatible with free will, because we are in charge of our own nature is making us in charge of what's happening, and so we would choose all the things that we're choosing. It's still a little fatalistic, and it's hard to sometimes make that argument. So Stoicism has always seemed more fatalistic even than Christianity, although Christianity has emphasized free will a lot more. It still has some fatalistic issues, especially because of the doctrine of predestination. So while most Christian thinkers hold to some kind of compatibilism, like I say, the important thinkers like Augustine of Hippo, who was also one of the people that is pulling all of that Plotinus and Neoplatonism into Christian theology, he also puts a lot more emphasis on free will than the Stoics did. So it's more about us making significant choices as opposed to only focusing on what's in our own control and our attitude to what's happening the way the Stoics do. Nevertheless, Christians also have this major emphasis on God being omniscient, that is, knowing everything, and God is also transcendent and atemporal, so presumably therefore knows everything to the end of history. And theoretically then, if God already knows what's going to happen, the idea is that therefore everything is sort of predetermined. And that idea, the fact that everything is maybe all happening according to a predetermined plan, including such things as eternal salvation and so on, that keeps this kind of flame of fatalism kindled, I think, within Christianity. So I don't think it's completely rejected from Stoicism, but maybe just has significantly less emphasis on it. And so essentially then, this whole full system of the Stoics breaks down, because without the logic and the physics, even though the Christians like a lot of the ethics, they don't really stand on their own as Stoicism. And so what you pretty much get is some appreciation of Stoic ethics that gets brought into a broader inheritance of Christian morality and ethics through the Middle Ages and into modern times. Christians, of course, like I say, have kind of an edited Neoplatonic theology that is also based on the Hellenistic Judean tradition that they had inherited at the very beginning. And instead, in place of both the physics and the logic that the Stoics had, Christians inherited Aristotle's logic and increasingly Aristotle's physics when Aristotle is recovered in the Middle Ages. And so Stoicism, like I say, therefore does not emerge, it's not like fully co-opted by Christianity, but it's one of the reasons why Christians, and indeed I think all of us to the present, I think people look back on Stoicism with more appreciation than we do have for some of the other philosophies which are more dismissed, like the Cynics and the Epicureans and so forth. And so that is my take on the Stoic Jesus, the interrelationship of those ideas, Stoicism and Christianity. I'm going to get some water, and Leandro is going to give me your questions and so on. All right, I want to thank a bunch of folks for the support that they've been giving us. So thanks to Gareth Morley, to Galen DaCosta, to Diana Patterson, to Sheldon Tiber, Charles Reynolds, Richard Eada, Jonathan Golden, Kerman Wingfield, Sally Gurka, Clifton Stuckey, the American Legacy Construction, to Jason Bishop, Kelly Higgins, Deborah Wells, to Ron Wagner, to Davius Tube, to Imofsky, to fire ever living, to just another Patty, Anders and Delister. Also, I want to thank Magic Mike for your support. Magic Mike says, curious if John has read the newly published article Josephus and Jesus by T.C. Schmidt. He makes bold and solid arguments for the Testimonium Flavianum saying the English translation was inaccurate. I have not read that, Magi Mike, but that is very interesting. I'm going to look that up because I'm always interested in the Testimonia Flavianum, which I also agree is, I'm generally already convinced that that's authentic, but I wouldn't mind having more bold and more solid arguments for that. Okay, Landro, could you page down?
Yes.
Thank you.
Give me a second.
Okay, so Julie Bazuski says, my favorite Stoic, Epictetus' view is on wealth, where he says that it lies with having few wants. Unlike Jesus' mendicants, people living ordinary lives can follow this advice to some extent. I think that's a great idea. So right, that's exactly it. So yeah, none of us, unless we're supposed to be doing it in community. I guess people do it as hermits, as Christians too. But let's say unless we're going to become Franciscans or clares or something like that, where we are in a community that takes vows of voluntary poverty, that's kind of like, to some extent, you're living. It's an extreme choice in some ways to be able to do that. You're definitely removing yourself from secular life to live in a spiritual order like that in Christianity. And so it's not everybody that can do that, but like you say, Epictetus saying if you modulate your wants, if you're not craving all of these possessions, if you're not materially oriented like that, that's something that we can all do, And so, in terms of that being compatible with what Jesus says, Jesus says, don't gather up, material treasures where rust and rust consumes and moths consume, but instead value the eternal, right? So if you are thinking of things that have these sort of eternal values like goodness and wanting to help others, charity, and so forth, I'm drawing those from like the Platonic forms, if we're thinking of those things as our wants, that's a more important want than these material ones. It's a little different from Epictetus, who's just saying, just don't want those things. I don't want anything. In other words, if you're content in all the things you have, then you are wealthy. So I think that those are the kind of the differences between, kind of Christianity has something in common with Stoicism and it has a little bit different focus. But yes. So Phil Finoto says, does sacrifice in this context mean they didn't eat the sheep? Because that would be a lot of dead sheep lying around. So no. So a lot of times people, modern times, we imagine that animal sacrifice in all of these pagan temples or in the Jerusalem temple, what means that they burn the whole sheep up and just destroy the property, essentially, and give it all to God. But that is very rare. So in the Judean context, that's actually what they call like a Holocaust sacrifice. That's where we get the word Holocaust, which is to say where you are destroying the whole thing as a sacrifice. Most all of the sacrifices are not. What they're burning is like some of the gristle and some of the parts that are kind of inevitable, and the rest of the meat is actually essentially being butchered and being brought back, and people are able to eat it. So almost all meat in the Roman Empire will have gone through kind of the sacrificial process, and so this is why when Paul in his letters is talking to Christian communities, and they're all thinking, well, I'm being invited over to my pagan friend's house, and they're all serving they're all serving meat that has been part of a pagan sacrifice, and since we think the gods are devils, isn't that a big hypocrisy for me to be eating that? And Paul's like, well, don't ask where it came from. We don't have to worry about that. But if you start eating it and then they say, hey, this is a pagan thing, and now you've eaten it, that's a desecration or something like that, then don't eat it at that point, is what but in other words, he's trying to have a practical response to that. And so yes, they are eating the meat. So the meat in general is not being totally burned up or something like that, unless there's a very special ceremony happening. Paula Strange says, does Stoicism lend itself to supporting the status quo, like injustice and oppression? So that is one of the criticisms that's leveled on it. So I think that if you were a Stoic and you're a Stoic apologist, you would, I think you would argue against that you're not trying to do that, that you're trying to live a virtuous life and modeling that, and so that is teaching the unjust and the oppressors not to behave that way, since as they are behaving, they are actually, they're not living a good life, they're not actually happy, they're not true in the Stoic understanding of those things. And you, by living that moral life, are actually hopefully leading them to that good behavior. But so that might be the apologetic answer. But external critics say yes, indeed. The problem is if we're constantly, just adjusting our attitude and giving in to the oppressor, then that does allow for unjust and oppressive systems to continue. Thanks to Processa for your support. Normative asks, to what extent is this overlap indicative of the thought of the historical Jesus, and how much is Hellenized early Christian authors reparsing the story? So I tried to differentiate that a little bit. And so when I was talking about things that are indicative of the thought of the historical Jesus, so when I'm pulling from the teachings part that I was drawing, especially from the Sermon on the Mount and things, I didn't go through with that and say, well, which of these are the most authentic teachings, or that we can say are authentic, but these are much more in keeping with the tradition that may be part of the oral tradition that gets us back to the historical Jesus. In terms of Hellenized early Christian authors reparsing the story, so it's completely possible that there's already a lot of Hellenized ideas that are operating in Galilee. But as you say, one of the things that has happened by the time we get to the written Gospels is that the original Aramaic teachings of Jesus have now been translated into Greek, and so they're written down in Greek for the first time. And so as a result, we may well be getting Hellenized spins on all of this, or more Hellenized spins, since the authors are now even thinking in Greek and writing in Greek. And so there could be that reparsing. And whereas I started with kind of sayings of Jesus, I then went on to stories about how Jesus acts in the Gospels, and those are, in a lot of cases, the creation of those later first century Hellenized Christian authors. And the same thing would be true, as I'm reading out what Paul and the author of Peter has to say on those kind of things. These are, once we're getting into, in both cases, Hellenized Judeans and their thoughts. So Paul is very trained in Greek rhetoric and things like that, so he's been exposed to this kind of ideas, and so then that may be where he's drawing them from them. Although some of the sayings that he had, even in those readings where he says, "Pray for those who persecute you," he's not saying that he's quoting Jesus, but it is in the tradition. Julie Bizuski says, I think that John's portrait of Jesus would make him a perfect Stoic sage, miracles aside. Do you agree? So yeah, so the portrayal of Jesus in the Gospel of John, as Julie's saying, is very different from the one in the Synoptics. So the Gospel of Mark has a much more human Jesus that is, getting angry, who has all kinds of other different emotions and so on. Whereas everything in the Gospel of John, the Jesus is walking around as kind of a divine being Jesus who is never, he's always in control. He's never, reacting based on passion or anything like that. He's, like you say, probably it's sort of an echo of what the perfect Stoic sage might do if there was a gospel written about that sage running around and facing opposition in different ways. Amofsky says, I think it was Chesterton or Tolkien who stated, Jesus was either the Son of God or nuts. Does John agree with this? And if so, which of the two does he agree with? So no, I don't agree with that. So that's that perspective. Let me see. So Leandro is giving me a note here. So he says it was C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity who argued that a man was merely a man, or the sort of things Jesus said would be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic or else he would be the devil of hell. So maybe it was C.S. Lewis as opposed to Chesterton or Tolkien. But in either case, whoever it is who's saying that, either Jesus is the Son of God or he's nuts, does not understand what the Gospels are. So they imagine that the Gospels are history books and that are reporting what the actual Jesus said or did. And so that is not the case. And so we've had a bunch of different lectures on the historical Jesus, but in a nutshell, the Gospels are written by Christians who believe that Jesus is the Son of God. And so the Gospel accounts are written to portray that. And so what the Gospels portray is that Jesus is the Son of God. That is not how the historical Jesus acted. And so it doesn't follow that the historical Jesus is either the Son of God or nuts. Rather, he was acting in a way that differs substantially from how he's portrayed in the Gospels. Julie Baziski asks, was Spinoza's philosophy basically Stoic? Because I believe he saw nature as an all-encompassing God. So, like you say, Spinoza's Spinoza's a materialist like the Stoics, and also sees God as an all-encompassing nature. But I don't think that means that he's basically a Stoic from all of the rest of Spinoza's thought. That component of it, he may have been influenced by it, and there's certainly the overlap there. But we actually need to do a whole lecture on Spinoza because it'd be great to refresh on that. Aman Pudama says, speaking very generally, did the Church Fathers and later theologians successfully amalgamate contrasting influences such as Platonism and Stoicism into one coherent system? So I would say no, in the sense that I don't think Christianity has ever achieved one coherent system. So I'd say that Christians are, and different Christian thinkers, the Church Fathers, later theologians, actually have a lot that they argue about. So just as an example, like the what we would call like salvation theory. So what's the whole reason? Why does Jesus have to die in order to defeat death, or what exactly? So there's actually multiple competing theological reasons for that. Just even what seems like a pretty basic part of what the Christian coherent system would be. And so I think that there is because Christianity ultimately is a vehicle that preserves and continues all of the Greco-Roman thought that got preserved and saved. It may be pulling it all together into, if not a system, into a big collection that Christians maintained and had access to.
But even at the beginning of when you mentioned the Church Fathers, there was a big debate with people like Origen, who were using Platonism apologetically
Yep.
to show the opponents of Christianity that Christianity was this is a valid system. This is a philosophical system that makes sense within the framework of your philosophy, whereas other early theologians, church fathers like Athanasius, were totally opposed to the idea of framing Christianity within a Greco-Roman philosophical structure.
Right, but even those ones like Tertullian and even the people who are saying, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? He says that, but he is also trained in Greek philosophy, and he uses Greek philosophy in order to do his own theology. This is like that discussion that is even happening in the Book of Maccabees. It is not it's not a fight between Greeks and Jews. It is a fight within the Judean people about how many Hellenized ideas of that are current in philosophy should they take in? How many customs should they accept? How much of their traditions as they understand them should they preserve and cordon off? And so in that same way, that's the argument among Christianity too, among Christian thinkers. And then they'll say things too, like Augustine will say, well, the Platonists are wrong on all kinds of things, as he takes as much from Plotinus as he can in order to make his theology. Okay. Fire Ever Living says, do you think Christianity's focus on worrying about sin might have come from the Stoic practice of constantly examining oneself for non-sage-like behavior? Well, I think not necessarily. It certainly maybe has, again, one of those things where we have resonance, where both of the things maybe are doing similar things, but it's really present right from the start in terms of this worrying about sin because of our earliest Christian writer, again, Paul, whose writings survive. This is just something that Jesus continuously worrying about. And so I think that also, that he also has derived that from his upbringing within Judaism, his training that he already had as a Pharisee. And so I think that's also, it's also an inheritance from the Judean side of the tradition too. Imofsky says, so why did early Christians believe Jesus was the Son of God? Well, one of the reasons I think is because the historical Jesus taught people to pray to God in a very kind of informal, personal way. So whereas one of the ways that people see God is being like God out of the whirlwind in the book of Job, where God is so awesome and powerful and terrible that it's frightening to even contemplate being in connection with or having any relationship with. Moses sees God and his face is forever changed, that he has to wear a veil afterwards because he's separated out from humanity. Whereas Jesus is saying, pray to Abba, to your Father, and to develop that relationship. And so because he uses that phrase, because in an early formulation, also within the inheritance of just in general thinking of the people of God as being God's children, and because of the Christian formulation that God's children are no longer simply coming out of an ethnic group, they're no longer simply people who are born Israelite, but they are becoming children of God after adopted after a covenant. So after you have come into a believing community of Christianity, we all become children of God. So with that analogy of Jesus as, all of us as children of God and thinking of God as the Father, I think that's the initial basis for Jesus being God's Son. We also have an early or very early tradition after Jesus' death of people having visions of Jesus being raised and sitting at the right hand of God. So the idea of Jesus as the Messiah in that way. And so all of these things come together when you're thinking about Jesus as the Messiah, Jesus therefore as being God's Son, Jesus as being God's glory, God's Word. All of these come together very early on in Christology, and so these are already present as of the writings of Paul. So within the first decades or so of Jesus's death. So it's very earlier than they understand what it means. So they don't have the theological tools to have, what does it mean that he's the Son of God? They have the phrase and the title before they come up with how they understand it. All right, well, very good. Next week, like I say, we're going to talk about why the Bible retells the Epic of Gilgamesh. The following week, we will ask, will Christianity survive the 21st century? And the week after that, a Leandro lecture. So thank you very much.